This forbidden photo of the Old West reveals what they tried to hide from you. Professor Michael Chen stood in the climate-controlled archives of the Wyoming Historical Society in November 2019, carefully examining a collection of photographs recently donated by the estate of a deceased railroad worker's descendant. As a historian specializing in Chinese-American immigration and labor history, Michael had spent 20 years documenting the contributions and struggles of Chinese workers who built America's western railroads. Most official records had been deliberately destroyed or falsified, making photographs invaluable primary sources. The collection contained typical images from the 1890s, railroad construction crews, town celebrations, formal portraits. Then Michael found a photograph that made him pause. The image showed approximately 15 white men posed formally on a dusty street in what appeared to be a small Wyoming town. The men wore suits and work clothes, their expressions serious. Behind them, wooden buildings lined the street. At first glance, it seemed like a standard commemorative photograph from the era, but something felt wrong. Michael had examined thousands of historical photographs, and he developed an instinct for images that contained hidden narratives. He pulled out his magnifying glass and studied the background more carefully. Behind the posed men, he could see darker shapes near one of the buildings, structures with blackened wood, broken windows, and something covered by what looked like tarps or blankets lying on the ground. Michael's pulse quickened. He photographed the image with his high-resolution camera and uploaded it to his laptop. Using digital enhancement software, he zoomed into the background details. What he saw made his stomach turn. The dark shapes were bodies covered with cloth. The blackened structures were buildings that had been burned. The stains on the ground were too dark, too irregular to be mere shadows. This wasn't a celebration photograph. This was documentation of violence, carefully staged to hide evidence in plain sight. He flipped the photograph over. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written, "Rock Springs, Wyoming, September 1891, town leaders, Rock Springs." Michael knew that name. In 1885, Rock Springs had been the site of one of the worst massacres of Chinese immigrants in American history, with 28 Chinese miners killed by white miners. But that had been 6 years before this photograph. Had there been another massacre that history had forgotten? Michael immediately began researching Rock Springs in September 1891. He searched newspaper archives, court records, census data, and railroad company documents. What he found was disturbing in its absence. Unlike the well-documented 1885 massacre, there were no newspaper reports of violence in Rock Springs in September 1891. No court cases, no investigations, no official acknowledgement that anything unusual had happened. It was as if that month had been erased from history. But Michael knew how to read silences in historical records. He searched for indirect evidence, obituaries, property transfers, population changes, railroad employment records. He found several anomalies. The 1890 census showed Rock Springs had a Chinese population of approximately 120 people. The 1892 city directory showed only 43 Chinese residents. Where had the missing people gone? There were no records of mass migration, no documentation of people leaving the area. Michael found something else suspicious. In October 1891, just 1 month after the photograph was taken, the Union Pacific Railroad had issued an internal memo restricting photography along certain sections of track near Rock Springs. The memo claimed the restriction was for security purposes, but Michael had never seen similar restrictions in other railroad documents from that era. Someone had wanted to prevent documentation of something that had happened in that area. He contacted colleagues who specialized in Chinese American history in the West. One researcher, Dr. Linda Zhao at the University of California, told him about oral histories she'd collected from descendants of Chinese railroad workers. Several families had stories about relatives who disappeared in Wyoming in the early 1890s, never to be heard from again. The families had been told their relatives had simply moved on to other work, but they'd never believed it. Chinese workers always maintained contact with their families and communities. Mass disappearances were deeply unusual. Michael returned to the photograph, studying every detail with enhanced digital imaging. He could now clearly see at least 8 bodies covered by tarps in the background. He could see scorch marks on multiple buildings. He could identify what appeared to be broken tools and debris scattered in the street. And he noticed something else. The men posing in the foreground were positioned very deliberately, their bodies blocking direct views of the violence behind them. This photograph had been carefully staged to create plausible deniability while still documenting what had occurred. Michael needed to find out who the men in the photograph were. He used facial recognition software and compared their faces to known photographs of Rock Springs residents from the 1890s. He identified 7 of the 15 men: the town sheriff, 2 deputy sheriffs, the mayor, a railroad supervisor, and 2 prominent local businessmen. These weren't random townspeople. These were the men who held power in Rock Springs, the men responsible for law and order. This discovery was significant. If local authorities were posing for a photograph at the scene of mass violence, it suggested they weren't investigating a crime. They were part of it, or at minimum, were complicit in covering it up. Michael searched for any records related to these specific individuals in September 1891. He found that the sheriff had resigned suddenly in November 1891 and moved to California. The mayor had left office unexpectedly in early 1892. Several of the other men had also left Rock Springs within months of the photograph being taken. Michael discovered something else through railroad archives. In late September 1891, the Union Pacific Railroad had paid out significant sums to legal settlements in Rock Springs, but the details were sealed and marked confidential. The amounts were substantial, equivalent to hundreds of thousands of dollars today. Corporations didn't pay that kind of money unless they were trying to make a serious problem disappear. He contacted the Wyoming State Archives and requested access to any sealed court records from Rock Springs in 1891. After weeks of bureaucratic delays and legal paperwork, he was granted limited access. What he found confirmed his suspicions. There had been legal proceedings in October 1891 related to civil disturbances and property damage in Rock Springs. But the records were fragmentary, many pages were missing, and crucially, all references to victims had been redacted or removed. However, one document had survived intact. A letter from the territorial governor to the railroad president, dated October 15, 1891. The letter was brief but revealing. Regarding the regrettable incident in Rock Springs last month, I concur with your assessment that public disclosure would serve no beneficial purpose and would only inflame racial tensions further. The workers have been compensated for their losses, the responsible parties have been dealt with privately, and the matter should be considered closed. The governor's letter confirmed that something had happened in Rock Springs that authorities wanted buried. Michael needed to find testimony from people who'd been there, who'd witnessed what really occurred. He began searching for descendants of Chinese workers who'd lived in Rock Springs in the 1890s. Through genealogy databases and Chinese American historical societies, he located several families whose ancestors had worked for the Union Pacific Railroad in Wyoming during that period. One family, the Wongs in San Francisco, had particularly detailed family records. Michael contacted Stephen Wong, a retired teacher whose great-grandfather had worked in Rock Springs. Stephen invited Michael to visit and shared a collection of letters and documents his family had preserved for over a century. Among these papers was a handwritten account in Chinese written by Stephen's great-grandfather, Wong Lei, in 1892. Michael arranged for the document to be professionally translated. What he read was harrowing. Wong Lei described working as a section hand for the railroad near Rock Springs in 1891. On September 12, 1891, tensions between white and Chinese workers had escalated after Chinese workers were accused of accepting lower wages and taking jobs from white workers. This was a common accusation used to justify violence against Chinese immigrants, though in reality, Chinese workers were often forced to accept lower pay and given the most dangerous jobs. Wong Lei's account described what happened next. On the evening of September 13, 1891, a mob of approximately 50 white men, many of them drunk, had descended on the Chinese section of Rock Springs. They'd carried torches, clubs, and guns. They'd set fire to several buildings where Chinese workers lived, shooting at people as they tried to escape the flames. Those who survived the initial attack were beaten and chased out of town. Wong Lei estimated that at least 20 to 30 Chinese workers had been killed that night. The next morning, according to Wong Lei, town authorities and railroad supervisors had gathered at the scene. Instead of investigating the murders or pursuing the perpetrators, they'd focused on removing evidence. Bodies were quickly buried in unmarked graves. Burned buildings were demolished. Surviving Chinese workers were told to leave Rock Springs immediately or face arrest for inciting riot. Those who protested were threatened with violence. Within days, the Chinese population of Rock Springs had been reduced by more than half, with survivors fleeing to other towns or states. Wong Lei's account mentioned one crucial detail. A photographer had been present the morning after the massacre. According to Wong Lei, a traveling photographer who'd been in town taking portraits had photographed the scene. Town leaders had confiscated his camera and plates, but Wong Lei believed the photographer might have kept one image hidden. This had to be the photograph Michael had found. Michael researched traveling photographers who'd worked in Wyoming in 1891. He found records of a man named James Burton, who'd operated a portable photography studio throughout the Wyoming Territory during the 1880s and 1890s. Burton had advertised his services in newspapers, offering portraits and town documentation. He'd been in Rock Springs in September 1891, according to advertisements he'd placed in the local paper. Michael traced James Burton's life after 1891. Burton had left Wyoming in late 1891 and moved to Montana, where he'd continued working as a photographer until his death in 1923. Burton had never married and had left his photographic collection to his nephew, whose descendants had eventually donated the collection to the Wyoming Historical Society, which was how the photograph had finally surfaced over a century later. Michael found something else in Burton's papers, a diary entry from September 14, 1891. Burton wrote, "I witnessed a terrible scene this morning. Bodies in the street, buildings burned. Town leaders insist it was justified, that the Chinese had attacked first, but I saw no evidence of this. They took my camera and destroyed most of my plates, managed to hide one negative, don't know what to do with it. If I show anyone, they'll kill me too, and we'll keep it hidden and pray someone finds the truth someday." Burton had lived with the knowledge of the massacre for 32 years, too frightened to reveal what he'd witnessed. He'd hidden the photograph among his collection, hoping that someday, when it was safe, the truth would emerge. Michael felt a profound connection to this long-dead photographer who'd risked his life to preserve evidence of an atrocity. Michael now had testimony from a survivor and confirmation from the photographer. Combined with the photograph itself and the circumstantial evidence from official records, he had enough to prove that a massacre had occurred in Rock Springs in September 1891, and that authorities had deliberately covered it up. Michael compiled his research into a comprehensive report. He documented the photograph, Wang Lei's testimony, James Burton's diary, the suspicious gaps in official records, the sudden departures of town officials, and the railroad's sealed legal settlements. The evidence pointed to a coordinated cover-up involving local law enforcement, town government, railroad management, and territorial authorities. The massacre had been erased from history because everyone with power had benefited from keeping it secret. Michael presented his findings at a conference on Western American history in Denver in March 2020. His presentation, titled "The Rock Springs Massacre of 1891, A Forgotten Atrocity," drew a packed audience. When he displayed the enhanced photograph showing bodies in the background while town leaders posed in the foreground, the room fell silent. The image was damning, visual proof that authorities had not just ignored the massacre, but had staged a photograph to document their control of the situation while hiding the evidence of violence. The presentation generated immediate media attention. News outlets across the country covered the story of the hidden photograph and the forgotten massacre. Michael was interviewed on national television, explaining how historical erasure had allowed atrocities against Chinese Americans to be forgotten. The photograph went viral on social media, with the hashtag Remember Rock Springs trending for days. But the revelation also generated backlash. Some historians questioned Michael's interpretation of the evidence. Descendants of the men in the photograph defended their ancestors, claiming the violence had been exaggerated or justified. Local officials in Rock Springs initially resisted acknowledging the massacre, arguing that Michael was attacking their town's reputation. The controversy revealed how painful it could be to confront hidden chapters of American history. Michael received support from unexpected quarters. The Organization of Chinese Americans issued a statement praising his research and calling for official recognition of the 1891 massacre. The Wyoming State Legislature passed a resolution acknowledging that grave injustices were committed against Chinese residents of Rock Springs in the late 19th century, and calling for further historical investigation. Several museums requested to display the photograph as part of exhibitions on anti-Chinese violence in the American West. Michael's next goal was to locate the burial site of the massacre victims. Wang Lei's account mentioned that bodies had been buried quickly in unmarked graves somewhere outside town. Michael partnered with forensic anthropologists and ground-penetrating radar specialists to search areas around Rock Springs where burials might have occurred. The search was complicated by over a century of development and landscape changes. After 3 months of survey work, the team identified an anomaly in a section of land that had been undeveloped scrubland in 1891, but was now on the outskirts of town. Ground-penetrating radar showed what appeared to be a mass burial site, containing multiple sets of human remains in shallow graves. The discovery was both heartbreaking and vindicating. The victims were still there, hidden beneath the earth, waiting to be acknowledged. Michael worked with state authorities and the Chinese American community to organize a proper archaeological excavation. The process was slow and respectful, treating the site as both a crime scene and a sacred burial ground. Over 6 months, forensic teams carefully excavated the site and recovered the remains of 27 individuals. Analysis confirmed that all victims had died violently, from gunshot wounds, blunt force trauma, or smoke inhalation. Personal effects found with the remains provided additional confirmation. Several bodies were buried with coins, buttons, and tools marked with Chinese characters. One victim was buried with a letter in Chinese, still partially legible despite decay, addressed to a family in Guangdong province. The letter spoke of plans to return home soon, of money saved, of hope for the future. That hope had been extinguished by hatred and violence. DNA analysis was performed on the remains, and samples were compared with DNA from descendants of Chinese workers who'd lived in Rock Springs. Stephen Wang provided a DNA sample, hoping to identify his great-grandfather's brother, who disappeared in 1891. The results confirmed that one of the victims was indeed Wang Lei's brother, Wang Jun. Stephen learned that his great-great-uncle hadn't abandoned the family or moved away. He'd been murdered and buried in an unmarked grave, his death hidden by people who'd never faced justice. As news of the excavation spread, more families came forward with stories about relatives who'd disappeared in Wyoming in the early 1890s. Michael collected dozens of testimonies, each one adding another piece to the historical puzzle. The stories revealed a pattern. Chinese workers who'd complained about wages or working conditions, who'd stood up for their rights, who'd refused to be intimidated, had been targeted. The massacre hadn't been a spontaneous riot. It had been a coordinated act of terrorism designed to intimidate Chinese workers and maintain white economic dominance. Michael discovered additional evidence in Chinese-language newspapers from the 1890s. These newspapers, published in San Francisco for the Chinese American community, had reported on the Rock Springs violence at the time. The articles described frantic telegrams from survivors, reports of mass disappearances, and demands for investigation. But because these newspapers weren't read by mainstream white Americans, and because Chinese immigrants had no political power, their reports had been ignored by authorities. One article from October 1891 was particularly revealing. It reported that Chinese community leaders in San Francisco had traveled to Wyoming to investigate the disappearances and had been told by Rock Springs authorities that no violence had occurred, that Chinese workers had simply left town seeking better opportunities elsewhere. The community leaders hadn't believed this explanation, but they'd had no power to force an investigation. They'd returned to San Francisco and urged families to avoid Wyoming, marking the territory as dangerous. Michael also found records of a Chinese consul official who'd attempted to investigate in late 1891. The consul had written to the U.S. State Department requesting information about Chinese citizens who'd disappeared in Rock Springs. His inquiry had been forwarded to Wyoming territorial officials, who'd replied that they had no knowledge of any missing persons. The consul's follow-up letters had gone unanswered. Eventually, with no evidence and no support from the federal government, the consul had been forced to drop the matter. These discoveries revealed a system of erasure that operated at multiple levels. Violence was committed by mobs, ignored by local authorities, covered up by territorial officials, and dismissed by the federal government. Chinese immigrants and their advocates had tried to demand justice, but their voices had been systematically silenced. The photograph James Burton had hidden was one of the only pieces of evidence that had survived this comprehensive campaign of historical erasure. Michael knew that accountability for the 1891 massacre was impossible. The perpetrators and complicit officials had been dead for a century, but he believed in the importance of historical justice, officially acknowledging what had happened, honoring the victims, and ensuring that this chapter of history was no longer hidden. He worked with Chinese American organizations, historians, and sympathetic politicians to push for formal recognition. In November 2021, exactly 130 years after the massacre, the state of Wyoming issued an official apology for the violence committed against Chinese residents of Rock Springs in 1891. The statement acknowledged that state and local authorities had failed to protect Chinese immigrants, had participated in covering up crimes against them, and had allowed perpetrators to escape justice. The apology was read at a ceremony attended by descendants of victims, including Stephen Wong, who wept as he heard his great-great-uncle's name spoken aloud and honored publicly for the first time. The ceremony also included the dedication of a memorial at the burial site. The memorial featured the names of all 27 identified victims, along with a statement explaining what had happened in 1891 and why it had been hidden for so long. The photograph, taken by James Burton, was engraved on a bronze plaque, ensuring that the evidence he'd risked his life to preserve would be permanently displayed. The memorial inscription concluded, "We remember these lives taken by hatred. We acknowledge the injustice of their forgotten deaths. We commit to telling the truth about our history, however painful." Michael worked with documentary filmmakers to create a film about the massacre and its rediscovery. The documentary featured the photograph prominently, using digital enhancement to show viewers exactly what was hidden in the background, while town leaders posed in the foreground. The film included interviews with descendants, historians, and forensic anthropologists, creating a comprehensive record of both the 1891 atrocity and the century-long cover-up. The story of the Rock Springs Massacre resonated beyond Wyoming. It became part of broader conversations about racial violence in American history, about which stories get told and which get suppressed, about who has the power to write history and whose voices are excluded. Educators began incorporating the massacre into curricula about the Chinese American experience and about the violent opposition to immigration that had shaped Western development. Michael Chen stood at the Rock Springs Memorial on a cold November afternoon in 2022, surrounded by descendants of the massacre victims and supporters who'd come from across the country. The photograph that had started his investigation 3 years earlier was now part of permanent historical record, displayed in museums and textbooks, impossible to hide or forget any longer. What had been banned, hidden and erased for 131 years, was finally visible. Stephen Wong placed flowers at the memorial stone bearing his great-great-uncle's name. "My family always knew something terrible had happened," he said. "We had the letters, the stories passed down, the grief that never fully healed, but we had no proof, no official acknowledgement. We were told we were exaggerating, that our ancestors had simply moved away. This memorial means our family's truth is finally recognized. Our ancestors' death finally matters in the public record." Michael reflected on how a single photograph, hidden by a frightened photographer and preserved by luck across more than a century, had reopened a case that powerful people had tried to close forever. James Burton had been right to hide the evidence in hope that someday someone would find the truth. His courage, combined with Wang Lei's testimony and the determination of descendants to remember, had ensured that the victims weren't forgotten forever. The photograph revealed something crucial about historical documentation and power. Those town leaders posing in the foreground had thought they were in control of the narrative. They'd positioned themselves to block the view of violence, believing they could hide the truth in plain sight. But photography had a kind of democratic power. It captured everything in the frame, not just what the powerful wanted seen, Details in the background, overlooked for generations, had eventually told the story the photograph's subjects tried to suppress. Michael's work had also revealed how historical erasure operates. The massacre had been hidden, not through a single act of concealment, but through a coordinated system of suppression operating at every level. Mobs committing violence, police refusing to investigate, local officials destroying records, territorial authorities dismissing inquiries, federal government ignoring appeals, newspapers declining to report, and historians failing to research. Breaking through that system required the photograph, survivor testimony, forensic evidence, and years of persistent investigation. Other researchers began following Michael's example, searching for hidden or suppressed photographs that might reveal forgotten atrocities. Similar images began surfacing from other locations, where violence against Chinese immigrants, Native Americans, and other marginalized groups had occurred. Each photograph opened another window into hidden history, proving that the Rock Springs case wasn't unique. Historical erasure of racial violence had been systematic and widespread. The photograph of Rock Springs in 1891 became symbolic of a larger truth, that history is written by the powerful, but evidence can survive their attempts at concealment. That photographs can be banned, hidden, or suppressed, but if they survive, they eventually speak. That victims and their descendants keep memories alive, even when official records deny them. And that confronting painful historical truths, however late, is essential to building a more honest and just future. As the ceremony concluded, Michael looked one final time at the memorial plaque showing James Burton's photograph. The men posing in the foreground, once confident in their power and their control of history, were now recognized for what they truly were, witnesses to atrocity who chose complicity over justice, and the bodies in the background, once hidden and dismissed, were now honored and remembered. The photograph had finally fulfilled the purpose James Burton intended when he risked everything to preserve it, revealing what they tried to hide, speaking for those who'd been silenced, and ensuring that truth eventually emerged from darkness into light.